Blair Fisher is the head of school at St. Paul's Episcopal School here in Mobile, Alabama. The last time I had him on the show, we talked about how kids today need to be educated to fully participate in the workplace of tomorrow. We posted that interview as a podcast like we do all of them, and there have been almost the greatest number of downloads of that interview with Blair as any of them altogether. It was a really successful conversation as Blair very clearly created the picture of what the future workplace needs to look like and what the students of today, how the students of today need to prepare. I've brought him back today to say, what is COVID going to do to them? What is at-home learning going to do to them? And what is COVID going to do to the workplace? How do we need to prepare the kids for this new workplace? Blair, thank you for your willingness to come back on the show. Welcome back to What's Working.
Thanks, Cam. I'm happy to do so, of course. Always enjoy talking to you.
So parents and teachers and students, administrators made huge changes in their lives at the end of the last school year to make way for home learning. What are your takeaways from this lesson? Are there things that surprised you both positively and negatively?
Yeah. That's a huge question, Cam. As you can imagine, none of us wanted this to happen, and in many ways, the rapidity with which the pandemic struck and forced decisions really in an extraordinarily time-pressured manner were challenging for all organizations, I would say, and including schools. So, the main I have sort of generalized takeaways I thought about this, and then a few positives. There's not many of those, and then some big negatives as well. So my big takeaways were schools really need to prepare for systems failure scenarios. I don't know another way to say that, but really for big shocks that change the very nature of the work that they do. Everyone says they need to prepare for those kind of scenarios, but they always seem to get put off in the real world as other things are more urgent. So I think really trying to make sure that schools carve out time for how do we react if the following occurs. Here in Mobile, obviously hurricanes are a possibility, so we have, storm plans, and that did come in handy to some degree during this, but I think schools really need to focus on that. A big takeaway for me was just how dependent we are upon our schools for our economy to function. And I think that's really coming into it's a big pressure point right now, the big argument over opening schools or not. But really, many of our families, the child care aspect of the school job is huge. I've learned really that although, remote learning can take place if it's done well, there's really no way to replicate the in-person teaching, especially for younger kids. Younger kids can't be online for long periods of time. They really need the hands-on, face-to-face interactions with the teachers and with other students for their social-emotional development. So that's a worry for a lot of educators looking down the road if schools have to stay remote for long periods of time, is what that's doing to the social-emotional development of a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. I think it's really important to build school communities so there's more resilience and frankly, more emotional connections and emotional support and caretaking of the families and caretaking of each other. A lot of the families that we serve were really struggling, loss of jobs, loss of income, that the level of anxiety within communities everywhere in America is really high. And I think that taking the time and energy to build positive communities with emotional, with big deposits and emotional bank accounts and stuff that help to build resilience and grace, I think is really important. How hard it is to run a school like St. Paul's, we're an independent school, but how hard it is to run a school when you have good people who believe very differently about the severity of the pandemic, and whatever stand you take, you're going to alienate somebody. The importance of proactivity, again, as I was talking about, prepping for worst-case scenarios. So as far as positives, I could only really think of a couple. That remote learning is possible if conditions are right and resources in place. Doesn't replicate the quality of in-person instruction, but it's doable if you're prepared for it. And I do think that probably a lot of parents have a new appreciation for the difficulties of teaching. I think we disavowed a lot of people about any desire to homeschool their kids. And then the big negatives I saw were how unprepared many schools were. And I don't want to, I try to stay away from public-private, but I think the bigger the school system, the more inertia is built into it, just by the factor of scale. And so many school systems just had huge challenges with shifting in their environment. Smaller schools can be more nimble, and independent schools were fortunate in that regard. And then finally, the disparities really between school systems in terms of their technology infrastructure and their overall capacity. This has got to be addressed. The gap between haves and have-nots grew even bigger during this time, the learning gap. There were entire, less well-resourced school systems, whether they were, urban systems or rural systems that simply did not have the funding to actually be able to move to a remote learning environment. Kids didn't have the devices, infrastructure training didn't exist, and so there were far too many of them that simply gave up their hands because they had nothing they could do. So I think that's got to be addressed structurally some way going forward to make sure that there's at least a baseline that schools can count on. Your income level shouldn't determine whether or not you can get a decent education.
So, Blair, do you think it's too early to tell that 10 years from now, employers will be able to see a difference in the students that were able to continue their education with the technology infrastructure in place and those that were unable to continue that infrastructure unable to continue due to lacking that infrastructure? Is an employer going to be able to tell these differences down the road, do you think?
My hope is not for a short period of time. It was really for us, we shut down for most of the last quarter and went to remote. My worry is, we have no idea what the future is going to hold, whether this, how the pandemic's going to play out, and, Health officials are saying that school systems need to be ready to open and shut and open and shut. And I think the more often and the longer that occurs, there's already deficits between the student. I mean, the single biggest predictor in success is academic success is the education level and the economic level of the families. And so if the have-nots simply become less and less and less competitive by having to go through this type of cycle again and again, people tend to forget that a lot of subjects and knowledge builds upon each other. And so if you think, pre-algebra, for example, or Algebra 1, you have to finish Algebra 1 to get to Algebra 2, right? And if you've missed a quarter of Algebra 1 because you were at home, that means you're not ready for Algebra 2, which is going to drive down grades, which is going to make them less competitive for colleges and stuff. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
So the more this happens, the bigger the gap is going to be. And as an educator who cares about kids, my heart goes out to those kids who, through no fault of their own, are going to be disadvantaged theoretically, for years and years to come if we don't get a handle on this really quickly. I won't get political, but funding should be in place that's not in place right now.
Have you seen scars, looking back, both in your personal experience as well as throughout history? I know you're a student of history. Have you seen scars of kids that had a traumatic experience happen to them in these coming-of-age years that lasted with them throughout their lives, that
Sure,
schooling didn't
you see
solve?
That most often with individual families that have gone through situations, but what we have now is we're putting a traumatic experience upon families where not only are the kids stressed, but they pick up the stress level of their families. And, mom and dad have both lost their jobs, or, if they own a small business and the business is shuttered, you have families that are extraordinarily stressed economically, which then creates stress in the family dynamic, which then creates stress in the child. I mean, anyone who thinks that kids don't pick up on the emotional cues of the family are crazy. Of course they do. And one of the worries I have is that there are so many millions of kids who have experienced this stress that some stress is good for you, right? Eustress versus distress. Well, this is distress. This is not good for them. And fortunately, kids are resilient, and the vast majority of our kids will come through this fine. But this has not been a beneficial thing for their development by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I'm curious what the back, let's say in February and early March, prior to this crisis unfolding, there were trends in education, and you keep up with those trends. We've talked about the trends. I'm wondering if any of those trends that were discussed as important back in February or March are even on the radar anymore, or is the trend
we hope
today?
To get back to them, but right now it's all hands on deck to get ourselves opened in a safe manner. Literally, I guarantee you, if you did a poll of school principals or school heads and ask them what is eating up your time, it is going to come back universally that they are engaged in trying to figure out how to get kids back to school in a healthy, safe manner. I guarantee you, it's eating up the vast majority of any time and bandwidth that they have.
I read At Stanford, I think, cut, I want to say, 16 athletic programs the other day due to this.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing. That really, the coronavirus pandemic, from a school perspective, and again, I can't speak for other schools besides my own, but there's no way that it's not similar. It is people who aren't in education don't realize that it impacts literally every aspect of the school's operations, from the facilities to intake to nursing, healthcare requirements to the curriculum to delivery of curriculum. And what do you do? If you have 90% of your kids in school and 10% at home, how do you educate both those sets of kids? Athletics. Obviously is a big impact. How do you do assemblies? For us, how do we do chapel? How do we do lunch? There's financial and legal and ethical aspects involved. You have an older teacher. Can you require them to come to school? Ethically, is that the right thing to do? There are huge waves of retirements occurring in the education world right now, which are only going to exacerbate the teacher shortage that's already out there. And you can't blame a 64-year-old teacher from retiring. Although kids may be, the research shows that kids are pretty, I don't want to say immune, but kids don't pick it up too easy. They don't transmit it too easy, and it seems to be generally pretty light on them. But I do think that we're in our overwhelming focus on the kids and the fact that it's not that they need to be in school. I recognize and appreciate that, and we're trying to do that too. But what about the older folks who have to work with them?
Yeah, I think that's a big concern, and I think, at least in my own awareness, I wasn't aware of the amount of work that it's taking the teachers to deliver this content the way they've had to learn to deliver it. I was frankly licking my own wounds, not looking outside to see the amount
right.
of work that they were doing to deliver this type of content. I know in our conversations past, you were keeping up with epidemiologists in the area to get a sense of what's going on. Real quick, we're about to move to break. What are you asking those epidemiologists now?
Well, we're very fortunate. We're blessed to have a epidemiologist among our parent body, and so literally this gentleman's on my speed dial, and we are so blessed and fortunate to have him. We have several doctors who we are in pretty much daily consultation with. And it's not just epidemiologists, but also pediatricians and internists and pulmonologists and stuff. And so they've been really helpful for us in navigating through this.
Yep.
And pressure testing our ideas and our opening plans and stuff to make sure that it meets best practice guidelines.
We'll be back
we're
after.
Very blessed, and we are, as an Episcopal school, we are paying that forward. We're making those guidelines available to sister schools and to really anybody who's interested. We're happy to share what we have. Because I'm a spread the wealth kind of guy. I want to do whatever I can to help other schools be successful.
We'll be back after this break with Blair Fisher, head of school at St. Paul's Episcopal School. You're listening to What's Working. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. What's Working is brought to you by Regions. On the line with me is Blair Fisher. He's the head of school at St. Paul's Episcopal School, making some predictions of what the workplace may look like in the future based on the experiences of the kids in school today. Blair, we've talked in the past about the skills a kid today will need when they enter the workplace and how education needs to keep up with the trends of employment. Has COVID-19 and the experience surrounding it impacted the way the kids are going to matriculate into the workplace? What do you think kids are going to take into the workplace today that may have been different in the past due to COVID?
I think the long-term skills that kids need is, in general, hasn't been affected. The same skills are needed. I think in some ways it may be more highlighted areas where there might be deficiencies or where we can get better. I think it's illustrated that there are many jobs that can be done remotely, and I wouldn't want to be an investor in an office buildings right now. But I think it highlighted the fact that some jobs, like education, don't lend themselves well to remote learning, not in a big scale. I think the vast majority of jobs are still going to require working in teams, and kids need to develop those skills. They can really only be developed in person. Structurally, I guess it's highlighted the need for a much more robust technology infrastructure in education and training for our students to succeed. I know that this is really, at St. Paul's here, we've had a desire or a thought to perhaps require upper school students to take at least one class online in any environment, just so they get used to that setting. And I think that this has really highlighted the value of that concept. high-paying jobs are going to take a lot of education, and as I said before, it's really something that's been very saddened to me about so many kids being left behind, and really the fact that there are two different kinds of workforces out there. There's the high-skilled knowledge economy where people can work from home, and while the lower-skill economy, people have to physically go to work to make ends meet. And, I think that's where a lot of the open and closed debate really highlighted the differences between those who had the ability to work at home and those who didn't. But I think in some ways, I'm someone who always tries to mine something for what good we can find out of it, right? And I do think that the kids who were successful were really those who were able to stay organized and be flexible in their learning and proactive and self-starters. The same type of things that really help us through any one of us through our lives were the same type of skills that those kids who were successful in the remote learning environment were possessed. And those kids who didn't, who relied on their teachers to keep them motivated and going, those were the kids that really struggled.
Yeah. So it's not going to the demands for the workplace or the demands of the workplace on individuals is not going to change.
I don't believe so.
Yeah. So, but the way we prepare them for that may change, or it has changed. It may not return back to normal. It may return to normal. It's too soon to tell. But those demands for the workplace aren't going to change. And frankly, they're the same demands that I've seen in the 20 years that I've been interviewing workplace experts. They're looking for people that can lead teams, that can communicate well, that can be on a team. That's not one that's discussed as much, but willingness to be on a team.
Being a good follower is also important.
Yeah.
Right? But, critical thinking and strong communication skills and cultural dexterity and proactivity and being a self-starter and attention to detail and all that kind of stuff, those skills, those are timeless skills.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think the 21st century, there's maybe technology skills that our kids need to have, but to acquire that maybe someone didn't need to 50 or 100 years ago. But really the same core skills that are essential for life success in general are timeless, I believe.
Yeah. So you're so well versed in this topic here, Blair. I'm going to throw you a question that we haven't discussed.
Sure.
What would you have changed in your own background that may have prepared you better for today, for these times of today?
Truthfully, my military experience. That was something, that people who have served are laughing right now because they're like, of course. And people who haven't, it's hard to explain. But really, what it comes down to is when I was in an environment where it didn't matter if you were tired, it didn't matter if you were cold or if you were miserable or you were wet or, you had a job to do and it didn't matter what your environment is. You learned self-discipline and you learned to suck it up and keep moving forward, and the importance of working in teams, and the importance of having inter-accountability, I think, were all very valuable for me. In the pandemic itself, I learned frankly that I don't particularly enjoy it. People say, "Oh, it must be nice to be at home." No, it was terrible. The relationships were much harder to maintain. Staying in strong communication was harder to maintain. Working on keeping the community, engaged and supportive, and the emotional caretaking and the pastoral aspect of being a community leader, all those were much harder online. Human beings are wired for face-to-face interaction. It's how we were, whether you're religious or not, it's how we either evolved or how God designed us. But in either way, we're social creatures, right? Yep. And being forced apart is not easy, and I don't know many people who enjoyed it. I know of almost no one at my school who enjoyed it.
Yep, and I'd like to raise my hand and include myself in that count, not enjoying this. Blair Fisher is the head of school at St. Paul's Episcopal School here in Mobile. Blair, thank you so much for your time. Folks, heading out. Have a good weekend. We'll have another show for you next week. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston, brought to you by Regions. Talk to you next week.